This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
I thought it was an extremely stimulating set of comments, and that would include Paul's paper. Before we move to some discussion, I'd like to throw a few points, if I may, that occurred to me as I listened to these papers. The first one, and of course it's a thought that will have occurred, I think, to many sitting here, but which I'd like to articulate and perhaps get comments on from our speakers, is the way in which, as China and Iran were being discussed by our speakers in the context of JFK's era, so much sounded familiar from the present day, but with the two actors reversed in many ways. In other words, the idea of a strange, non-European power not engaging with the wider international community, for which read, of course, American-dominated international order, and of course a terrifying fear that the worst possible thing that could happen would be that that regime would get nuclear weapons. Now, in this particular case, clearly we are not living in a world today where China has become the kind of at least partial ally that Iran was to the West in the 1970s. But it is also a signal reminder that the context, as our international relations colleagues will remind us, I don't know, sitting in a room full of international historians and mentioning international relations is perhaps a slightly tactless move, but would remind us that there are parallels and even patterns, dare I say models, that's probably pushing it too far, that might be useful in terms of thinking how we weigh up the importance of ideas and perceptions as opposed to what our realist friends, and yes, all of us have some, even though we don't like to admit it, might think of as interests. In this particular case, it seems that one of the results, and certainly again it has a parallel today, but sticking now to the 1960s, that is very important, is the relative, not absolute, but relative lack of dialogue that took place with the People's Republic. And one of the things that I would just throw into discussion coming from the other side, as it were, the China specialist side rather than the US side, is that the opening up of the Foreign Ministry archives in Beijing, the partial closing down again at Christmas time as it happens, but still broadly speaking, the opening up of archival documents in China all the way up to the Cultural Revolution's outbreak in 1966 has begun to throw a lot more light on the nuances within the Chinese positions at this time, when it's clear that there was more of an attempt in some circles of leadership, I think, to move towards opening up dialogue. Just as we've known for some time that the simple policy of non-engagement with China until Nixon miraculously visited in 1972 is an overly simplistic way of looking at the engagement between these two powers. The second brief point I'd like to make perhaps relates to Iran more directly in a sense. Well, no, I'd say it relates actually to the Iran-China comparison again. That's the question of modernization and modernization theory, which came up rightly over and over again. The one element that I think I would like to throw in here that perhaps moves us not away from, but perpendicular to the idea perhaps of the sort of clash of the modernizations, the American model versus the Soviet model, the Ward Rostow model versus something driven partly by Marx, partly by Lenin, is I think the growing realization again that there was more agency in the third world, in the global south, however you want to characterize it, during this period. And this is never as true as it is during the period of the Kennedy presidency. We've just heard mentioned the Great Leap Forward famine of 1958 to 62, one of the great human disasters caused by a party that was clearly not on the job in the shape of the Chinese communists in the 1960s. But what is sometimes ignored is that the origins of that particular disaster come from very distinct and strongly Chinese and both non-Western but also non-Soviet attempt to create their own model of modernization. We do, of course, hear in Paul's paper about the building up of China and India as rivals to each other, but perhaps less about the way in which Nehru's dialogue on Hind Chin Hai Hai, the the use of India and China as the two anti-imperialist emergent powers in the Asian region also provided its own version of modernization. And the final thing that, and I would say in that context, the Iranian modernization is one of the alternative non-Western models that would also be interesting to explore further in terms of what occurs bottom-up and what occurs top-down in the context of alternatives. Very final point, I think, that is worth making, and picking up again from Matthew's very astute comment, I thought, on the use of horde rhetoric, the kind of yellow masses waiting to strike down, is how quickly the target shifts. That, of course, was the identical language that was used in the 20s and 30s, fear of invasion by immigrant hordes causing discriminatory legislation in the US and Australia and elsewhere, changing, of course, in the 1930s and 40s to the Japanese in the context of World War II, almost immediately in the context of the Cold War, switching back to the Chinese. Dare I say that possibly in the present day, the Iranians may yet be suffering some part of this particular discourse in our current global settlement. But rather than bring it back to the present day in any extensive way, I'd like to just leave those thoughts there and open the floor for discussion. I think since we started about 10 minutes later, we can probably go to just 5 to 5 or so. That's right. Yeah, that would be good. I wondered actually if, first of all, if Claudia or Matthew would like to make any response.
I would just make a very quick comment on your point about the autonomous process of modernization, that I think this country in the 60s and the 70s, this is always an underestimated point when it comes to Iran, because the general assumption is that they basically followed an agenda that was imposed either by Washington or by Moscow in case, in some regard, also in the 50s. While, as I tried to point out very briefly in the presentation, a lot of it, especially a lot of what was later encompassed by the White Revolution, was an autonomous project, and the fact that it was perceived by Washington as something that was actually following their suggestion, Western agenda, changed a lot the perception that was the perception of the project and also the outcome of the project. They basically overlooked all the side effects that we had, mostly because they thought that you could follow the course that was decided by Washington, while on the other hand, the very autonomous origin of the project biased the outcome, biased the course of the progress, and brought this kind of problematic overlapping of what was designed by Washington and what was designed by the Shah in his own agenda of getting a lot more independence from his ally in the Western world. So I totally see your point, and especially now that we get access to a lot of memoirs by Iranian leaders, biographers, and people who actually get access to the private papers of some of the Iranian policymakers at the time, are trying to make this argument stronger and stronger in order to also to change the idea of these local proxies as simply puppets of both of the superpowers, also in terms of economic reforms, not just in terms of military reforms, military plans, but also in terms of what they perceived should be done in terms of progress of their own country.
Just that, as Rana said, I mean, if you work on the Chinese nuclear program and Western reactions to it in the early 1960s, you're always struck by the parallels with Iran, current debates about Iran's potential to develop nuclear weapons. And one thing that you've seen come across is that once you move away from Kennedy and his immediate entourage of advisors, and actually read some of the more detailed policy planning and staff papers that were composed before China has the bomb, a lot of them are actually very, very sober and reserved and conservative really about what they feel is the impact this will have. Most of them actually come to the conclusion it will actually produce more caution, more realism, more pragmatism in Chinese behaviour. Not that it will actually contribute to, it's not that it will actually make China be more aggressive or that China becomes somehow more dangerous once it has the bomb. It actually seems to be the very reverse that they're predicting.
I'm terribly sorry, maybe could you explain what their logic is and why it would make the Chinese more cautious?
Because they would conceive themselves perhaps as being more vulnerable, their own nuclear facilities and nuclear capabilities, because they are still in development because they are relatively small in number, the nuclear stockpile they have, that's extremely vulnerable to an attack. That's extremely vulnerable to a nuclear strike. And the possibility they could actually use those nuclear weapons is obviously largely discounted in these early years because they will be subject to an overwhelming nuclear response from the West and from the United States. And so there is no military, strategic kind of change in the balance of power, if you like, that's produced by the Chinese acquisition of the bomb. What they're mainly concerned about, as I tried to indicate in the paper, is the political and psychological changes it might produce in Asia. And that comes through the argument, it's then necessary to reassure your friends and allies that you will stand by them if you're threatened by the Chinese.
Thanks for that thought. I see a hand already there. Go on. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I have a couple of comments to Matthew's paper and then one comment on regarding India. You just mentioned that again, why the Kennedy or that the Kennedy administration saw China so much more as a danger, and why only as a danger. After all, after the Cuban Missile Crisis and the American University speech, Kennedy publicly talks about rethinking the Cold War, rethinking enemy images. So he in some ways, he has developed regarding the arch enemy, the Russians. Why are they still stuck to a certain view of China? Why not thinking, well, if we can deal with the Russians, why not? Why should there be a chance with China too? And regarding the tide of people, I disagree. What you mentioned as a comment might have played a role, but I'd rather see the way Lawrence Friedman earlier mentioned Kennedy's book about England and World War II and the difficulty of democracies to move their people, while for dictatorships, supposedly, they can just, someone makes a decision and then everyone has to go along. So in that case, having several hundred million people who just by someone calling them, go to war or whatever, I think maybe that's more Kennedy's concern. One comment, and he's not here, of course, but regarding India, I thought it was unfortunate that he didn't mention Jackie Kennedy's visit and just totally excluding public diplomacy as part of, a part of Indian-American relations, because I really think that's also something we should focus on if we look at diplomatic history, also look at the public diplomacy part. And Galbraith said this did more for Indian-American relations than many of the other things that happened during maybe more than anything that happened during the Kennedy administration. Jackie Kennedy going there and having a rather pro-American attitude, but maybe
One way of responding to that, I think, the first thought you had about the reasons why China is regarded as sort of menacing, if you like, in this period, is the unexpected consequences of the Sino-Soviet split. When Sino-Soviet relations were being considered by American policymakers in the 1950s, one of the assumptions was that if you put pressure on the bloc, as it was known, that eventually you would drive these two powers apart. That Chinese demands on the Russians become so great, intensive security for economic support and so on, that it would fracture the relationship. And then China would become somehow more manageable, because the Chinese would move somehow closer to the West, if you like, would become more reasonable in their international behaviour. So it was almost believed, you could tame China through the breaking up of the Sino-Soviet bloc. What happens in the early 1960s is actually completely opposite from what had been anticipated, in that the Chinese become, in Western imagination, more dangerous because they become, in a sense, rivals and competitors with the Soviet Union for leadership of the world communist movement. So they have to do the Russians in terms of perhaps the imperialist rhetoric and their behaviour and actions, and who they will support in the developing world as well. So in that sense, China becomes more dangerous because of the Sino-Soviet split. So the Sino-Soviet split is actually not welcomed in a strange kind of inverted way by the early 1960s, and it actually helps. I think it helps to explain why. Lots of people have said, well, why does it take the Kennedy administration so long to recognise the split and to deal with the split? And it's because it is confusing because of this changing perceptions of the way that the dynamics of the split will work. But what China is doing in the early 1960s is, its anti-American rhetoric is extreme. It is very violent. What it's saying is propaganda against the United States. And it's taking actions which, Americans regard as very hostile. It is supplying arms to Canada. It does supply arms to Canada. It does give direct support to movements which, are struggling against the United States and the world. So I think that helps to explain But I would also want some of these cultural factors as well. I wouldn't sort of completely retreat from that. I would also want some of these cultural factors to be an influence, some of these longer term trends in American political culture where they view, an Oriental end, if you like, and why those images get transferred.
There was an extremely ambiguous relationship that China and the US had during World War II, which was very much within the living memory of many of the people involved in these sorts of decisions, which had gone from being a sort of plucky ally to this sort of corrupt husk. But then, of course, there's still a China lobby. This is probably the last stage at which the China lobby has genuine influence in Washington. At this point, it's still there, and it's, of course, fueling these sorts of perceptions as well. Shall we keep it going? Other thoughts, other hands? Yes, good. Okay, well, let's try that. Let's get a couple of points in that case, and then bring it back to our panel. Yeah, go ahead.
This is Matthew. To what degree do you think, it strikes me that, and this has roots before, the Kennedy administration is very focused on what you might call a sort of internationalist, semi-pseudo-cosmopolitanism. That people who sort of place huge emphasis on arms control, on deals, on reform, there's this whole structure here. And the Chinese really don't play ball with any of that. That the potentially a reason why they get particularly hysterical about Russia and China, particularly compared to the Soviet Union, is that not people take part in the system. And secondly, it's actually links very well with what Rana was saying, is to what degree does Taiwan play any part in this thinking? Or the people, because there are two Chinas, of course, there's the Republic of China. Are they at least talking to Washington about it?
Well, should we just get some other points to bring all that so people can ask that? 'Cause I see there's quite a few hands now coming up. Next to you, and then we'll just go along. Sure, go ahead.
I had a question about you both mentioned, or particularly for you, Ms. Silvio. You mentioned how modernization actually shifted from sort of an idealist discourse to more authoritarian forms. And I was just wondering if you could sort of identify when that happened. Because, I mean, I'm always struck by how early it actually happens, because you already have sort of a manual on counterinsurgency being produced pretty early on, and the role of modernization in that. And, well, my second question, I forgot. So
we can come back, it's fine. Was there one further one? Yes, go ahead.
On Iran, on your point on Iran, I think that part of it is the whole Tocquevillian concern about the revolution, higher expectations, and that you have to keep, as expectations rise, but attainment isn't rising so quickly, you need to keep a lid on things. But on China, I wanted to say that also the Americans had never fought the Russians, but had fought the Chinese just a few years before. And when push came to shove, the Soviets talked crazy, but back down. And Mao had just in '62 had attacked India, so the Soviets had not been attacking anybody overtly.
Although in 1962 it might not have seemed quite that way in the middle of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
But they had the kind of modus vivendi after that. And finally, in 1981, I remember a Czechoslovakian professor telling me a story that the Soviets' great fear that the Chinese attack, and on the first day the Soviets capture 50 million Chinese, the second day they capture 100 million Chinese, and the third day they capture 200 million Chinese, and on the fourth day the Soviets surrendered.
A nice story. Let's take the points back to you first, Claudia. What about modernization and that shift, and then that rather nice sort of reference to Tocqueville and the idea of the most dangerous, well, of course, the Chinese leadership are saying the same thing today, that the most dangerous point is when the higher expectations come from the revolution.
This is very much one of the key questions. Obviously, we historians are always obsessed with turning points. So a lot of people question whether was Kennedy to bring this kind of shift towards the support of the regime, or it was mostly Johnson's fault to become fully supportive of this kind of regimes. I think that the most convincing explanation from this report that came out 2 years ago, so thanks God they are on our side. Obviously referring to the many allied countries that were actually ruled by dictators, if you want to put it very clearly. And the book basically argues that the support for these kind of regimes was a kind of a pendulum that started to move the very moment in which those ideas were put into practice, and slowly but irreversibly moved towards this more explicit endorsement to those regimes. But it was a kind of, as I said, a kind of irreversible movement that started in 1961, the very moment in which you have basically the new frontiers coming and say, we want to bring those new ideas to the third world, that very moment they start to change. It started to be basically put into the reality of those countries, which were unique contexts that needed unique answers. And so in this very moment, you have this shift towards the authoritarian support of the regime and so on. And on the point of counterinsurgency, again, you have this basically the same scheme. Basically, you have the Kennedy administration saying at the same time, at the very beginning, in 1961, you have them saying, we have to go there and teach them how to embrace the takeoff theory, but at the same time, we start supporting also the counterinsurgency. The two things go side by side, and they don't go, they're never independent one from each other, because the moment in which you need to put in practice a policy that encourages this kind of development, you can't forget that you're dealing with a regime that could be on the verge of collapse, could be really bringing those countries into the Soviet bloc. So you need to back them up with this kind of other strategies that strongly involve counterinsurgency from the very early 60s, not later, but some have argued with respect to Viet Nam and so on and so forth. In terms of rising expectation, that's always been another key point. And that's one of the reasons why, as I was trying to emphasize, they do support this call for democracy, call for reformism. This is really, there are really moments in the early 61 in which they really think that this is going to be the beginning of a new phase. On the other hand, they're very aware of the potential long-term effects of this rising expectations on the solidity of those regimes. So that's why they say kind of, okay, we like your ideas. The moment in which they start threatening the stability of those countries, we have to be really, really careful to those ideas. So we endorse rulers like the Shah, who try to get to the world audience saying, we are going to champion these reformism, but we will always keep an eye on those rising expectations, not to be overwhelmed by those expectations. And obviously, the result we have in 15 years from there, from that moment, is the revolution. So you can keep them silent for a while, but you can't really avoid dealing with them sooner or later. But for that time, for the Kennedy period, it was okay this way, and I think that has a lot to do with different timing and talking point about how things happen, and you can really arrange everything at that time instead of at the time.
Okay, thanks, Chloe. Matthew, we've got a couple of quotes for you there. Pseudo-cosmopolitanism, very French, and Taiwan, and of course the experience of having fought in Korea just a decade previously.
I mean, Korea is extremely important for understanding this Southern American estrangement, because there are establishing a constructive relationship between the two. It's immensely important, all the way through the 1960s as well. One of the points you were making bears on something that Rana was saying about this nature of the Sino-American relationship, and I talked about the fact, obviously, the United States wants to maintain the posture of containment and isolation of Communist China in the 1950s. And from one point of view, some Americans will say, well, China refuses to play ball, refuses to undertake serious international negotiations and discussions, and it behaves in this sort of relatively hostile fashion. But of course, from the other point of view, from China's point of view, not recognised by the United States. The United States supports a rebel government on Taiwan, which is, sabotage and subversion on the mainland. There are rebel troops as well in northeast Thailand, from the Chinese border there, which given support to the Korean War, the American forces, which came right up against the Chinese border and prompted this intervention. And the United States does all it can to isolate China in trade terms as well throughout the 1950s. So there's another way, of casting that.
Oh, definitely.
And there are these, there are Sino-American ambassadorial talks which go on from 1955, starting 1955, this was really one of the outcomes of the first Barbara Strait crisis. And they first convened in Geneva and then it was Warsaw. And they are a channel of communication, at least, between the two sides, where some messages can be exchanged, or some nuances can be picked up about changing behaviour and ideas. I think they do form a function, actually, in the period 1964-65, when the United States is stepping up its involvement in the Viet Nam War, in that the Chinese, through these talks, are able to sort of signal how far really the Americans can go before they're going to trigger some kind of Chinese response, in the same manner in 1950, where a Chinese response had been triggered. So they're almost like a warning to the United States. But in the American administration, first of all, McKinley and then the Johnson administration, there are some voices who say, well, perhaps we do need to change our stance here. Perhaps we do need to give the Chinese an opportunity to show that they can engage in a more constructive kind of relationship and dialogue. So the emphasis there begins to change. And Roger Hilton gives a speech in San Francisco in December 1963 where he expresses this kind of openly, doesn't really get very far. In 66, President Johnson gives a major speech on peace in Asia, where he talks about the need eventually perhaps to have a dialogue with China. And the onus becomes less on containment and isolation, more becomes containment, but it will be China which almost self-isolates itself. So rather than by active American measures, the Americans begin to sort of relax the travel ban a little bit more. Questions about relaxing the travel ban. So perhaps you can lower, relax the atmosphere between the two. And then the Cultural Revolution comes along in 1966 and completely, really rules out any, sense of rational dialogue because of what's going on in the Chinese foreign ministry.
What about the Republic of China? Does that affect? Are they putting pressure on you? Are they talking to the US or influencing the US in some way?
Well, yeah, there is still the China lobby. It's decreasing in power and importance. But it does play a role in certain rational angle and how far the administration feels it can go. Not least that, there is a strong vested interest by the 1960s in the State Department. There's strong vested interest in maintaining strong ties to nationalist China and Taiwan.
As late as 1968, at the Miami Republican Convention, candidate Nixon did a quick Foxtrot interview with Madame Anna Chalot. So that's quite late in the day. Splendid. I think we've actually managed to take ourselves just past 5 o'clock, so I think, Matthew, it's probably time for us to take a 10-minute break or so. Great. Thank you all very much for our panelists.